Mob spawning is perhaps the single most important game mechanic in Minecraft. And while almost everyone has made a mob farm, have you ever wondered how different design decisions impact the farm's efficiency? Like, how much does elevation actually affect mob spawning? How does the mob cap really work? Or why do so many farms have this weird outer roof around them? These were some of the questions that I had, so I decided to find out. I also wanted to understand the particular dynamics behind mob spawning, how these dynamics connect to all mob farms, and how to use these dynamics to find the most efficient way to design any type of mob farm. In the end, this journey gave me an understanding of the fundamental principles behind mob spawning that is applicable to a huge number of Minecraft farms, and I wanted to share that with you. So my goal for this video is that after watching it, you will have a detailed understanding of the mechanics behind mob spawning. You will be able to understand the real game impact of different design decisions. And finally, you will be able to apply these principles to any mob farm and design your own custom farms that fit your particular need. I do want to note here that this is a massive topic that can be applied to many different types of farms. So the focus of this video will be the common mechanics behind all mob spawning, not the particulars of any specific type of mob farm, only the universal mechanics. But with all that out of the way, let's start with the very basic. The Minecraft wiki defines a mob as an AI-driven game entity resembling a living creature. So hostile mobs like zombies, creepers, and skeletons, but also passive mobs like chickens, interactive mobs like villagers, and even ambient mobs like bats. When talking about spawning, we are not referring to mobs that generate as part of a structure, like villagers in a village or vindicators in woodland mansions, nor are we discussing breeding or forced spawning, like a wither, warden, or raid. Additionally, we are not discussing special spawning rules, like pigmen spawning in portals or zombie reinforcement spawning. In this video, we are talking about the natural spawn cycle, or mobs that just seemingly appear in the world as you play the game. It can be hostile mobs, ambient mobs, animals, or even location mobs like guardians or witches in a witch hut. These are all part of the natural spawning cycle. Behind the natural spawn cycle is the spawning algorithm, which is what this video is really about. And while it's quite simple in the basics, it also has a significant number of little details that are important to understand when maximizing farm efficiency. So for the basics of spawning, all spawning happens around players. Between 0 and 24 blocks away from the player, mobs will not spawn. Inside of 32 blocks, mobs will not despawn. If a mob has been more than 32 blocks away from a player for 30 seconds or more, it has a 1 in 800 chance of despawning every game tick. At over 128 blocks away, mobs will despawn immediately. This does not apply to animals or special mobs like villagers. The very basic flow of mob spawning is this. The game first calculates the current state of the mob caps, which is the max limit of mobs that can exist in the game before the algorithm will stop spawning for each mob category. Then if it finds there is space within the mob cap, it will start the spawning attempt process. This is a multi-step process with a lot of consideration, but to simplify it, the attempt will either result in successful spawns or a failed spawn attempt. Finally, the game will run the despawning portion of the algorithm, which will despawn mobs that meet the despawn criteria. At this level, it's pretty simple, but there are a lot of details to fill in. Let's start with the mob cap. This is, at the end of the day, one of the biggest factors when talking about optimizing mob farm. So it's important to understand, and also, luckily, a pretty easy concept. Essentially, there's a limit to the amount of mobs that can spawn in the world at one time. The mob cap is not a hard limit, as it is possible for more mobs to exist than the mob cap. But once a mob cap has been reached, the game will stop naturally spawning mobs of that category. It should be noted that this is only applicable to the natural spawning cycle. There are other ways in which mobs spawn regardless of the mob cap. Even so, the mob cap is split into 8 different categories called spawn groups, with a different mob cap each. Each of these are independent and evaluated separately each spawning cycle. The workflow is like this. The algorithm identifies every loaded entity in the game. Then it looks at every entity in that list and determines if it should be counted towards the mob cap. And if this is true, it increases its spawn group's mob cap count. If the mob cap for a spawn group is exceeded, the game will stop spawning mobs for that category. The implications for this are pretty simple to understand. If we want to maximize the amount of mob spawning, We should prevent the mob cap from ever being reached. The best way to do this? Well, murder, and quickly at that. We quote-unquote kill the mobs after they spawn. The time it takes to kill the mobs is called the time to kill. Kill is in quotes. It's really time to remove from the mob cap, which can be through killing the mob, moving them through dimensions, name tagging them, having them pick up an item, or picking them up with a minecart or boat, all which count for quote-unquote killing in time to kill. In general, having a short time to kill is better because each time a mob is cleared from the mob cap, another mob can spawn, which means that the time to kill is the base limiting factor for mob spawning rates. That said, there is a common misconception here. The mob cap has no influence on how often mobs spawn when below the cap. The mob spawning rate with, for example, hostile mobs is the same when there are 0 mobs counted toward the cap, as if there are 69 mobs counted towards the cap, which is 1 less than the mob cap. So the difference between the actual mobs and the cap has no influence on the efficiency of the farm until you are exceeding the mob cap, then the efficiency will drop. What this means is that if you have a farm with a long time to kill, but the amount of mobs counted towards the cap never hits the cap, then decreasing the time to kill will not have any impact on the farm efficiency. Unlike with, say, iron farms, where the time to kill is inarguably the most important factor. Mob farms are a bit of a balancing act. If you have a high spawn rate, time to kill is very important, and the mob cap will be the limiting factor to how fast the farm can actually go. But if you don't have a high spawn rate, then the time to kill only has to be fast enough to maintain a non-full mob cap. So those are the basics, but there are a couple of things to clarify here. First, each dimension has its own mob cap, so moving mobs between dimensions is a good way to quote-unquote kill a mob. It is actually faster to clear the mob cap in the origin dimension than actually killing it. This is because the mob will count towards the cap during the death animation, which takes 20 game tick, and portals only take 2 game tick. This is one of the reasons why portal farms are so overpowered. In addition to each dimension having its own mob cap, each player also has its own mob cap. There's actually 2 types of mob cap, the player mob cap and the global mob cap. Before we continue, an important concept to understand is the importance of chunks. Chunks are 16 by 16 block areas which go from world bottom to world top. The world is loaded and updated in terms of chunks at a time, which then updates the individual blocks and entities within a chunk. The local mob cap counts just the mobs within a 17 by 17 chunk area centered on the player towards that player's mob cap. The global mob cap, in contrast, will count all chunks within a 17 by 17 chunk area centered on any player on a server, and take the total number of chunks from all players divided by 289, which is just 17 by 17, and multiply that resulting number by the single player mob cap, which will then give us the global mob cap. The detail here is that chunks are only counted once during this calculation, even if they're within the range of 2 players. So if 2 chunks are close enough to each other that their 17 by 17 chunk areas are overlapping, then the overlapping chunks will result in a lower global mob cap. But players who are in the same dimension but far away from each other will essentially add their independent mob caps to each other for the global mob cap. This doesn't mean that either player will have more spawning, because they will be restricted by their local mob cap, but they will be playing with a single player mob cap unless one player is exceeding their personal mob cap. Then they will essentially be stealing mob cap space from the other players. So how do we apply the concept of mob caps to farms? Well, the first, most important thing to note is the importance of mob proofing. As discussed earlier, the despawn sphere around a player is 128 blocks. So all potential spawning spaces outside of a farm that are within 128 blocks of a player need to be spawn proofed. If not, the mob cap can become filled and greatly impact the farm efficiency. Often spawn proofing is minimized by AFKing high in the air to lift the spawning sphere away from surfaces. Mini HUD is a great mod to use when spawn proofing, as you can draw a despawning sphere, which helps a lot with farm design, placement, and troubleshooting. In general, there's nothing magic with spawn proofing. Just make sure it's done properly, or the farm will suffer. But assuming the farm has been properly spawn proofed, how does a mob cap impact the efficiency of spawning farms? Well, as mentioned, this mostly relates to time to kill. We can demonstrate this with Nem Bomb's Enderman farm, which has a very high spawn rate for reasons which we will cover later. But for now, we can just run a little experiment. This is a manual kill farm without softening the mobs first, so we can adjust the time to kill by adjusting our weapon. I ran 2 tests, one with an OP netherite sword with full enchantments, and another with an iron sword. And here are the results. The netherite sword can clear the mob cap much faster, which will allow for more spawning. The correlation is very clear. The lifetime is about 3 times longer when using an iron sword, and as a result, the spawning is about 3 times slower than the OP netherite sword. It's almost a direct correlation, which highlights the importance of reducing time to kill. But this is only for farms that have such a high spawning rate, and Nembum knew this. So for instance, with his general mob farm, he designed it to be easily built, but with a longer time to kill, because the mob cap is never reached anyways, so there is no benefit to having a shorter time to kill. But that brings us on to our next topic, the algorithm. I just want to mention really quickly that these videos take a lot of effort. For example, to get into the level of detail that I desired for this video, I had to teach myself to decompile and read the Minecraft source code, from never having even touched Java before. So if you like this type of content, please show your support. You can like, comment, subscribe, or share with a friend. It really helps us smaller creators. I really appreciate it. Now back to the video. Optimizing mob farms takes a balancing act between the mob cap and spawning rates. But how do we boost spawning rates? Well, here's what I call the bulk of the algorithm. In my mind, the mob cap and despawning portions are auxiliary functions to the algorithm, but are of course very important. The algorithm itself is where the magic happens. So there are a couple of parts here that are important. The basic flow is as follows. The very first thing the game checks is if the world is divisible by 400. If not, all animal spawning is skipped. If so, animal spawning continues for this tick. This is why animal spawning is so slow. It's intentionally 400 times slower than all other spawning. Next, the mobs that can count towards the mob cap are counted. This happens before any spawn attempts, but is updated when a successful spawn takes place. The algorithm then takes a list of each valid spawning chunk within range of a player and iterates through it. Within each chunk, the algorithm iterates through each spawn group and checks several conditions. But most consequently, it checks both the global and local mob cap. And if there is space in both of these, it will continue the spawning attempts. Then we get into the actual attempt. For each chunk, the game selects one random position to originate its spawn attempts from. The X and Z coordinates are both completely random from within the chunk. The elevation selection is based on a concept called a height map. A random elevation is selected below and including the height map plus 1 to select the Y coordinate. We will get into this more in a little bit. Once the position has been selected, the game will attempt up to 3 back spawning attempts for that position. Once 4 mobs spawn or the spawn attempt fails, the back spawn attempt is completed. The game continues to iterate through all the chunks in the same way until they all have been processed. This process happens every single game tick. There are a lot more details of course, and we won't get into all of them in this video. But there are 2 portions that deserve a bit more attention. The concept of the height map and pack spawning. When discussing elevation and spawning, the main topic revolves around the concept in the Minecraft code called the height map. There are a couple of different types, but we are concerned with the world surface height map. If we take any random X and Z coordinate in the world, the height map is the highest block in that column. When the algorithm finds a spawning location, it will select a random location between the world bottom and the height map plus 1. The plus 1 is there so the spawn can actually happen at the air block above the top block in the column, which would be the block's top surface. So let's look at an example. For ease, we will use the end. The world bottom is Y0. If we have a block at Y10, then the spawnable elevations go up to 10 plus 1. Meaning we have 11 valid spawning spaces, and this is true, except that the game is a little bit weird. The game picks a random spawning elevation between world bottom and height map plus 1, meaning here between 0 and 11, but inclusive of both 0 and 11, meaning that there are actually 12 spawning elevations to select from. So an elevation of 0 can be selected, but it will fail because you would have to have a platform 1 block under the bottom build limit, which is impossible. The implications of this algorithm are quite straightforward. The less potential elevations, the less potential locations the game can pick from, the higher probability that the game picks a desirable location. The only way to reduce the amount of potential elevations is to reduce the elevation of the top block in the XZ column, i.e. build the farm as low as possible. Building the farm low alone won't work though. The farm has to have sky access over the entire farm, because the height map is based on the top block in that XZ column. So any blocks over a farm will make the height map increase and decrease the probability of spawning. So there is an easy way to calculate the probability of selecting any one elevation. It is just 1 divided by the amount of potential spawn attempt elevation. So the height map plus 1 minus the world bottom elevation plus 1. Or more easily expressed, 1 divided by the highest block plus 2 minus the world bottom elevation. Simplifying for all dimensions, we get these. We can then plot them and see the result. It is clear that having the top block elevation as low as possible is very important to boosting spawning rate, as there will be a sharp decline for any elevation above the minimum elevation. Going from the lowest possible elevation to just 1 block higher will decrease the spawn probability by 0.17, which is a huge decrease. But even at the very bottom block, we see that the probability is 0.5, meaning 50% failure. This is because of the possibility of selecting the world bottom as an elevation, which will always fail. So when we are looking at, for instance, building farms in the overworld, that means that removal of bedrock is necessary to get the absolute highest spawning rates, because bedrock generates up to 5 blocks from the world bottom. In the nether, it would require removing bedrock from both the world bottom and the world ceiling, as the bedrock roof lifts the height map for the whole dimension. But of course, it sucks to remove bedrock, and in fact, it sucks to build farms so low. So is there anything else we can do to boost rate? Well, yes. This equation is for the probability of selecting any one elevation in the column. But what if we increase the number of platforms in that column? Now we can swap that 1 out with n for number of platforms, and that y out for y map. Or actually, I prefer to use the bottom platform elevation, since this is typically the determining factor rather than the top elevation. So for a 2 block gap, the total height, including the platform, is 3 blocks. So the spawn probability equation would be this. When we plot this for around y0 in the overworld, we see that at the beginning the function is quite linear, but it flattens off and there is a diminishing return around 20-ish platforms. If we extend the equation out forever, it will approach 1/3, since we are essentially trying to fill 1/3 of the height map with spawning spaces. But of course, we will never quite reach 1/3. And in the actual game, there is a height limit, and building very tall farms for little gain isn't usually worth it. So to get a good cost-benefit ratio, maybe up to 10 spawning platforms is reasonable. Let's say for a drop kill farm landing at sea level, like this one. And this is actually the very famous Nembomb General Mob farm that is just simply one of the best Minecraft farms ever made. But this farm was designed before 1.18, so the world bottom was 0 rather than -64. Its bottom platform elevation is at 96 blocks, and it has 10 platforms plus a roof. This gives a probability of picking a valid elevation of about 8%, which is equivalent to a single platform at Y8 in the overworld prior to 1.18, but is much easier to build. This farm has been nerfed in 1.18 and above because the world bottom was lowered, but you can still get these rates. You just need to build 17 platforms instead of 10. Or you can lower the whole farm so that the top is at sea level, but then you have to dig quite a bit. So you can see it's a bit of a balancing act. For instance, the absolute best spawning rates will be at world bottom, breaking bedrock with 1 layer, as was done with end of life farms. But this is a lot of work. So this is why knowing the dynamics is important to be able to customize for your particular case. In summary, build very low with sky access, or build lots of platforms with sky access and adjust with some simple math. Not too bad, right? But this is just the probability of getting a valid Y elevation. So at the end of the day, it's just a small part of the puzzle. Now we move on to a topic that I believe a lot of people are unfamiliar with, but is very interesting and is most of the rest of the puzzle, that is mob spawning. Pack spawning. Pack spawning is very interesting, but it also can be a little bit confusing. When people think of spawning, they often think of one mob spawning in one location. And for good reason, because, well, it's logical. But that's not the way the game actually spawns mobs. Mobs are spawned in groups of quote-unquote packs, which attempt to spawn near each other. When the game picks a location for a spawn attempt, that location is not actually where mobs themselves spawn, but rather it is the center of the pack spawning attempt. I will call this the spawn attempt origin. So let's go back a little bit. The game runs the algorithm, it passes all checks, and gets to a chunk to attempt a pack spawn. It chooses random X and Z coordinates, then a Y coordinate based on the height map, and we now have our spawn attempt origin. Now from this location, we do our pack spawning attempt. The algorithm does up to 3 pack spawning attempts. For each attempt, the algorithm selects a random mob that is valid for the biome. Each mob and biome has a minimum and maximum pack size, and a random pack size is selected between these two numbers. Most mobs just have a pack size of 4, which will be selected every time. Once the mob type and pack size is selected, the algorithm makes up to a pack size number of attempts to spawn the mob. There are a number of failure cases here, like colliding with other entities, not having a spawnable location, or being out of range. But we won't go into too many details in this video. If that pack spawning attempt is completed, but 4 mobs haven't spawned, then another pack spawn attempt will take place, and then another for up to 3 total pack spawning attempts for the same spawn attempt origin location, which can spawn up to 4 mobs total. These can be different mob types for each pack attempt from the same location, but the packs themselves always have to have the same mob type. What is perhaps most interesting here is how the actual spawn attempt locations for individual mobs are selected. Mojang has implemented a technique called a triangular distribution to distribute the members of the pack. A triangular distribution looks like this. There is a much higher spawn probability near the spawn attempt origin, and less further away. Triangular distribution sounds fancy, right? Well, in practice, it's very simple. The algorithm just takes 2 random numbers between 0 and 5, inclusive of both, and subtracts them from each other. Then it adds the resulting number to the spawn attempt origin coordinate. It does this for both X and Z coordinate. The Y coordinate does not change. The resulting coordinate is where the actual individual spawn attempt will happen for that particular mob. Whether or not the spawn attempt is successful, the algorithm will continue with further pack spawning attempts, but the starting location is now the location that the previous spawn attempt occurred. So this gives us a displacement between -5 and 5 for both X and Z coordinates each individual spawn attempt within a pack spawning attempt. As mentioned, this method means that packs will have a higher likelihood of being clustered closely together near the pack spawn attempt origin. To illustrate the impact, I've made a simple JavaScript program that runs this algorithm and outputs a heat map. So the colors represent a probability of one of the 4 attempts of trying to spawn a mob on that particular location, with brighter being a higher probability. In the start, it's kind of random, but we can see that the probability is higher around the origin point. If we jump forward 100,000 ticks, the heat map comes to steady state and we find our final heat map for a single spawn attempt origin. An actual spawn can happen up to 20 blocks away from the actual spawn attempt origin in both X and Z directions. That being said, about 85% of spawns will happen within 5 blocks of the spawn attempt origin, and about 99% within 10 blocks. So what if we apply this to a whole chunk? Well, here is our result. We see that this is a little bit strange, right? There's some bleed over into the chunks around it, and the corners have slightly less probability. But I mean, it makes sense. The corner blocks have less probability because they are surrounded by less potential spawn attempt origins in this calculation, since the spawn attempts are originating just from the chunk itself. It might seem like an issue, but if we surround the chunk with other chunks, we see that the map flattens out completely, and the locational distribution of mobs in the game is even, albeit they should be clustered into small groups on average, which is exactly what we see in game. But the real question is, why does pack spawning matter? Well, in this case, there is an immediate and impactful application for pack spawning. To explain, let's take a small step back. When picking an elevation, the game uses the height map +1, right? So let's assume the game chooses this XZ column here. We have this stone block with only air under it. The game will select a random position between world bottom and 1 block over the stone block. Here we might assume the only place that there will be a valid spawn attempt origin is the top of the stone block, which itself is a valid spawn location. But this is wrong. Spawn attempt origins do not need to originate from a spawnable location. So if the game picks this air block in the column, it will then be the location of up to 3 pack spawning attempts, which as we know can spawn even quite far from the origin. So potentially on the blocks around that selected air block, at the same elevation, even up to 20 blocks away in the X and Z directions. So without the pack spawning roof, the game will never pick elevations up here, since the height map is only extended to the top block in the column, which would be these grass blocks down here. The spawn roof basically allows spawn attempt origins to occur up to 1 block over the roof for the coordinates that the roof is covering, which then can be the origin for mobs that will spawn in the farm itself through the pack spawning portion of the algorithm. The impact of this can be quite significant. I tested this in game with a chunk-sized platform, then increased the pack spawning roof by 1 block at a time. Here are the results of a series of 10-hour tick warps, and the equation that approximately follows the data series. We see that even just 1 block increases the spawning by 20%, which is massive for almost no work. 5 blocks gives a gain of about 70%, and the max gain of about 84% is achieved at 15 blocks. The gains start to diminish pretty rapidly after about 7 blocks. This is a really solid increase, and for quite little effort. It's perhaps one of the best way to improve most mob farms cheaply and easily. I have to add a caveat here though, as the amount of gain will be based on the platform side, with larger platforms having more benefit. Not every farm can achieve a 84% gain, but it is still worth it in almost every situation. So adding the roof is one thing, but there is also an important detail here. If the spawn attempt origin location has a solid block at its position, the game will skip the pack spawning attempts at that location. So you want to make sure that the blocks that are on the same elevation as foot level are not solid blocks, or you will not gain any benefit from the pack spawning roof. So the general recommendation is build a pack spawning roof with air blocks at the foot level of each platform. The roof should be built at the same elevation as the top spawning platform or higher, and 5 or 10 blocks is probably enough depending on the application. So really, that's it for the main topics. There are certainly more details to dig into, but this video would end up being hours long, and I really wanted to focus on the main mechanics that would give returns to all mob spawning based farms. I guess the last thing to do here is go through an example of how we apply these mechanics to a real farm. Like this one. This is kind of like Nembomb's general mob farm, but worse. There are a lot of tutorials like this on YouTube with people who want to quote-unquote improve Nembomb's farm, but don't quite understand all of the dynamics. So to start, we have mob cap logging and see that we are easily under the mob cap. At this point, we want to push the spawning rate. The first thing we can do is open the farm up. The benefit is twofold, both which we just covered. The spawn roof will boost spawns, and removing the solid blocks next to the platform will allow these locations to pack spawn also. The benefit ends up being about 25% more spawning. You might wonder why it's not that 84% listed earlier, but it's pretty simple. With that example, we had 256 spawning spaces per Y elevation. And here we have 112 spawning spaces. So the likelihood of benefiting from the pack spawn roof is much less. It's not a linear drop, but this is expected as pack spawning favors larger platforms. Continuing on, we still aren't pushing the mob cap because we are at such a high elevation, but we don't have to dig to push spawning further. We can achieve more spawning by increasing the amount of spawning platforms. Building up is certainly an option, but as the returns are diminishing, it's maybe not the most effective. More effective is just to build more platform towers. With 4 columns, we are pushing pretty hard against the mob cap. Now we have increased our mob spawning rates by 2.7 times more than the single tower, without changing the elevation. But I have to say, I kind of hate this. We have 4 towers. Copy and pasting more farms is not very exciting in my mind. And as we can see, there are diminishing returns. We did 4 times the work for only 2.7 times the rates, which doesn't feel great. So let's try to push and optimize a little bit more. We know the elevation has a huge impact, so that is the obvious thing to do. So we can bring the farm down to bedrock level to improve spawning, and the change increases spawning by 2.4 times the same farm at sea level. which is huge as expected. The thing is, here is where the balancing act comes into play. I may hate the option to have 4 towers at sea level, but those 4 towers are actually giving us a little bit higher spawning rates than this single tower at bedrock level. And going to bedrock is much harder than just building 4 easy to build towers. So while I hate the copy and paste game, for most people it will be easier to build 4 towers if it fits into your build. But in this exercise, we're not going to live with that. So we are already at bedrock. What more can we do? Well, there are 2 ways to improve this farm now. One is to push it towards the mob cap. Even though we are already hitting the cap, the goal is to have a mob spawn as soon as there is any space in the cap. The second way is by decreasing the time to kill, which reduces the impact of pushing against the mob cap. We can improve the time to kill by lowering the water platform down a little bit and then adding some portals to where the hole was, which will let us replace our drop kill with a portal quote-unquote kill and maintain a light level of 0 on the platform. The average time to kill here decreases by 57 game ticks, which is a 20% improvement. This arrangement also allows the farm to be lowered further, which then improves the spawning rates and further pushes against the mob cap. The benefit over the drop kill is about 9%, which, while not massive, is a pretty solid gain. But if we want to push further, there's one last thing we need to do, and that's to squish the farm. These columns are very nice for ease of building, but when getting into high efficiency designs, the short, fat farms are much better to reduce the overall elevation. Sure, we are pushing against the mob cap a lot already with the column farm, but it can be pushed further. Right now, the mobs are populating when there is mob cap space, but ideally, they should spawn as soon as possible. We can do something like this, where we have one spawning elevation and multiple collection. And now we have pushed against the mob cap to near the maximum for this style farm. It's a 60% improvement over the last design, and 5.1 times the rates of the very first farm. This is where we can see that the mob cap, while it's not hard to push against, isn't going to be an absolute hard stop until we get into extremely efficient farms with very high spawning rates. With spawn tracking, we can actually see that we get over 69 mobs alive per tick, meaning that we are constantly pushing against the mob cap, which means that at this point, we have pushed this farm to near the max for this particular style. But it's also like kind of a pain to build, and it's not very elegant. Actually, I personally don't really like this farm much at all, but it does help illustrate how to apply the concepts in this video, even if it's not a super amazing farm design. If we want to push the farm further, the time to kill needs to be reduced further. This is where you need to get creative and hopefully a bit more elegant, like the Methods Creeper Farm, which can also be a general mob farm, which uses boats to phase mobs into portals. This is an elegant design. It's short and fat and has a very short time to kill. Or even better, the ultimate mob farm, the End of Light Farm, which uses update suppression and update skipping to slice portals and suppress light until it was patched out of existence. I mean, this farm applies all the concepts in this video perfectly. It's built at the minimum elevation, requiring bedrock breaking. It uses pack spawning promotion in places it won't spawn. The time to kill is 2 game tick, which is the fastest possible. You might wonder why they don't use all the spawning spaces, but that's because they are constantly pushing up against the mob cap even with the shortest time to kill possible. It really is perfect, but too perfect, as Mojang patched it in 1.19 and then again in 1.20, and clearly want to remove it from the game completely. So at this point, you might have been hoping for some new OP farm that you can build and a tutorial and all that. If so, I am sorry to say that this video will not provide anything new in terms of farm, unless you really want to build this ugly thing. But for me, as explained at the beginning of the video, the goal and hope is that anyone who has gone this far in the video will have a deeper understanding of the mob spawning algorithm and will better understand the implications of why farms are designed how they are and how to modify and design your own farms. So I hope that this video has helped you on your journey and will hopefully motivate you to empower yourself to experiment and play with these mechanics yourself. There is no new farm, but my hope is that perhaps one of you can maybe design the next overpowered End of Light replacement. I'd like to give a huge thank you to a number of people who helped make this video possible with various forms of support. And also a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. I really appreciate the support. particularly Iana Arch, Brett Fanning, Kote Tanuki, and Carl, who are all at my top tier. If you aren't a supporter, please consider supporting, as it really helps us small creators. But with that said, the biggest thank you of all goes out to you, the viewer. If you made it this far, you are a total rock star. I really appreciate all the support. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.